Reheating foods on Shabbos on top of a heat source. Is one allowed to heat foods on Shabbos that have already been cooked? What restrictions are involved? What forms of heating are allowed and what forms are not? And in which situations does a cooking prohibition apply and in which do they not? So reheating foods on Shabbos is one of the basic activities that is performed in a Shabbos kitchen in preparation for usually the Shabbos day meal, in which the food was left overnight either in the fridge or under room temperature and you would like to warm it up. Whenever one comes to warm up a food on Shabbos, it may involve one or of two or both prohibitions. The prohibitions relevant to warming up food on Shabbos is number one, the biblical cooking prohibition, as we will discuss. There are certain scenarios in which a food which has been pre-cooked still contains a cooking prohibition relevant, and hence warming it up on Shabbos, heating it up on Shabbos would transgress the biblical prohibition against cooking. And furthermore, a second prohibition relevant to heating foods on Shabbos is even if it's a food that does not contain a cooking prohibition, as we will discuss. Nonetheless, the sages restricted the form of heating that may be used to heat the food on Shabbos, so that it does not look like you are cooking. In other words, the Chachamim made a decree that one may not heat foods on Shabbos even if they do not contain a cooking prohibition, in a method, in a form that to others it appears like one is regularly cooking on Shabbos. It may only be heated in a way that does not appear like cooking. So anyone who wants to heat a food on Shabbos must negate these two prohibitions. Number one, he must make sure this is a food that does not contain a cooking prohibition. Number two, he must make sure that the method of reheating is not a method that is considered halachically one to look like one is cooking and thus rabbinically forbidden. We will now discuss the details of these two matters. What foods contain a cooking prohibition upon reheating and what foods do not? So there are three conditions that must be fulfilled by a food in order for the food to no longer retain a cooking prohibition. Number one, the food must be fully cooked. If the food is not fully cooked, which means that it has not been cooked to the point that it's fully soft and its texture has fully changed, but still needs a little more cooking to soften it, then it has a biblical cooking prohibition applicable on Shabbos, even if it was 99% cooked before Shabbos or throughout Shabbos, and it just needs 1% cooked. So rules the Alter Rebbe in 253.18, 318.10, based on the Ramah 253.2, Machaber 318.4, and other poskim, unlike those who rule that if it's been cooked to Ben Drusai, it no longer has a cooking prohibition. We do not conclude like that opinion. So first and main condition, the food must be fully cooked as defined in Halacha. Number two, the food must be dry. Even if the food was fully cooked before Shabbos, if it contains cold moisture, either due to it being a food that contains liquid or due to condensation forming in the fridge, that condensation, that moisture, that liquid that the food contains, even though it was fully cooked before Shabbos, contains a cooking prohibition to reheat, as is discussed in length in chapter 318, which in truth is under dispute, but the conclusion is that we are stringent and it contains a cooking prohibition. How dry must the food be? How much moisture makes it problematic? So it must be completely dry to the point that if you would touch it and then touch a second finger, the second finger will not feel any wetness. This is called an halacha. It's not tefeach amanas latfiach. If it is, it has a cooking prohibition to reheat it on Shabbos. So is the ruling of the Alter Rebbe in a number of places, and so is recorded in the Ktseis HaShulchan as the direct definition of moisture. This is unlike other opinions who are lenient, based on a misprint in Rabbeinu Yerucham, and this has no place in the classical poskim. So the first condition, fully cooked. The second condition, must be dry. Third condition, the item, the food, does not melt. The Alter Rebbe rules in the Siddur, and so is the final ruling, that a food which melts upon being heated, such as congealed fat, gravy, etc., contains a biblical cooking prohibition against doing so. Even though it was fully cooked before Shabbos, and even if you feel it now, it feels dry because it's fully congealed. According to some poskim, there is also a fourth condition. Same method of heat. There's a discussion in Hilchos Shabbos in 318, the laws of cooking, regarding if one may reheat a food in a different heating method than it was cooked in, such as to roast a cooked item. And the final conclusion is that it's not allowed. So therefore you may not take a dry matzah ball that had cooked within boiling water and place it directly across from a flame for it to heat up on Shabbos, as that is a different form of heating. However, if you place the matzah ball in a pot or on top of a pot in which it's not directly in contact with the heat, there is an interval of metal, then according to many poskim, including the ruling of the Alter Rebbe in Shulchanaruchharav, it is permitted, it is not considered a separate heat source, a different heating method. This is unlike the ruling of the Mishnah Berurah and others, which does consider it problematic, and according to them, you would not be able to heat cooked foods, meaning foods that were cooked in water and are now dry, on top of a pot or inside of a pot and the like, due to a cooking prohibition. So to summarize, the only type of food that may be reheated on Shabbos without containing a cooking prohibition is a food that is fully cooked, fully dry, and does not melt, such as, for example, a piece of baked schnitzel. It's dry, it's fully baked, I want to heat it up on top of the fire on Shabbos, may I do so? This now leads us to the second section of this question. The methods of heating. Once we have negated a cooking prohibition, what methods of heating may be used? So we already said the Chachamim made a decree that you may not heat it in a way that looks like you're cooking, as is explained in chapter 253, Halacha 2 in the Mechaber 253-2. And accordingly, it's forbidden to place a food, even if the food does not contain a cooking prohibition, as we explained, on top of a flame on Shabbos, because it looks like you're cooking. You may not take a pot with dry, fully cooked schnitzel, fully baked schnitzel. You may not take a pot of dry, fully cooked rice and place it on top of your flame on Shabbos, due to it looks like it's cooking. It's under rabbinical prohibition. Furthermore, even if the pot was already on the fire and you removed it momentarily and you want to put it back, there are 6 conditions that must be fulfilled, as we will discuss in a further halacha, and lack of fulfilling these 6 conditions makes it look like you're cooking and is restricted under the sages. Furthermore, even a blech that covers the flame, or an electric plate in which you don't actually see the fire, initially placing a pot of food on top of it on Shabbos to warm up, the consensus amongst most poskim, and so is the practiced custom amongst jury, is to forbid doing so under the rabbinical restriction, being that it's possible to cook on a blech on an electric plate, and here too it looks like you are cooking if you initially place it on top. Those who are lenient based on their personal rabbanim have upon whom to rely, but the general consensus of the poskim is to be machmir in this issue, to consider it like that it looks like you're cooking, and thus you may not heat a pot of food directly on top of the blech or electric plate. So what's left? We negated everything. You can't put on top of a flame. You can't put on top of a blech. So how are you supposed to heat a food on Shabbos that doesn't contain a cooking prohibition? So there's one method that remains, which is a great method.